It was a harsh time, marked by fear, tension, and battles for power. The Jewish people, cornered and relentlessly persecuted, tried to keep their faith alive, while the Seleucid Empire crushed any sign of resistance. It was against this backdrop that the name Gorgias emerged, and he did not come in peace. Named by Lysias, right-hand man to King Antiochus Epiphanes, Gorgias was more than just a commander. He was chosen to quell the rebellion that was spreading like wildfire in the heart of Judea. No one knew exactly where he came from or when he was born, but what everyone knew and feared was his reputation on the battlefield. They said he was quick to attack, cold in his strategy, and merciless in defeat. A man trained in the logic of war, guided by orders and not by faith. The kind of figure who commanded respect just by mounting his warhorse, with shining armor and eyes that never blinked. Subscribe to the channel for more exciting biblical stories and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any videos. If this content touches your heart and you want to support us, feel free to click on the "Thanks a lot" button. All help is welcome and makes a big difference. When Lysias sent him ahead of 5,000 infantrymen and 1,000 horsemen, the message was clear. This was no ordinary mission. It was a hunt. The head of Judas Maccabeus, leader of the Jewish resistance, was the prize, and Gorgias went to Emmaus with a well-designed plan. Attack by surprise at night, crush the rebels, and return home in glory. He camped in the plains surrounding the city, watching the territory, waiting for the right moment. Everything indicated that victory would be easy. After all, he was the most experienced commander available, a true general. The kind of man who won wars on the map before even setting foot on the battlefield, while Gorgias armed himself to the teeth and marched confidently toward the rebel camp, certain that Judas Maccabeus would be sleeping in makeshift tents with his weary men. A crucial detail went unnoticed. The enemy was not stupid. Judas was no ordinary warrior. He did not think like the other leaders Gorgias had faced. And that was precisely when things began to turn around. In the dead of night, with the silence broken only by the muffled sound of footsteps on dry earth, Gorgias led his troops into battle. But when they reached the camp, they found only wind and canvas. Not a soul in sight. No fires burning. Nothing. The camp was empty, as if it had never been used. And then came the shock. Across the plains, smoke rose thick and dark like a punch in the sky. It was Gorgias's own camp on fire. Judas, cunning as a fox and brave as a lion, had turned the tables. While Gorgias searched for him, it was Judas who found the Seleucid army off guard. He and his men attacked with strength, courage, and faith. A smaller band, without shining armor, but with hearts on fire. When Gorgias' soldiers saw their own camp being destroyed, panic set in. Gorgias, running back and seeing the smoke, realized immediately that he had been deceived. He tried to reverse the situation, regrouping what he could, but the damage was already done. It was like trying to hold water with his hands. The defeat was not only physical, it was moral. A commander who set out to win ended up returning empty-handed, biting the dust of wounded pride. Defeated at Emmaus, but not destroyed, Gorgias retreated with the bitter taste of shame in his mouth. For a general like him, pride was everything, and wounded pride was fuel. He knew that if he wanted to erase that stain on his reputation, he would need a new victory, quick, decisive, one that would rub his strength in the face of Judas and his followers. That's how his eyes turned to Jamnia, a well-fortified coastal city where he could set up a new base of operations. There he regrouped, devised strategies, and spread the news. Gorgias was still in the game, and what's worse, he was willing to do anything to win. Meanwhile, two Jewish leaders, Joseph and Azarias, watched the commotion from afar. They were young and brave, but lacked Judas's experience. Perhaps they were impatient. Perhaps they were driven by a desire to prove their worth. They saw Gorgias alone in Jamnia and thought they had a chance. It was a golden opportunity, they thought. Without telling Judas, they decided to attack. What happened next was an epic blunder. Gorgias was more than prepared. It was as if he had been waiting for exactly that kind of mistake. When the two young leaders arrived with their men, overconfident, they encountered heavy resistance. The Seleucids crushed the attackers with ease. Joseph and Azarias narrowly escaped, but their army was not so lucky. Many fell. The defeat was humiliating. In practice, Gorgias had achieved what he wanted, a victory that would wash away some of the shame of Emmaus. It wasn't against Judas, but it was still a victory, and for the Seleucids, that was enough for now. But Gorgias wasn't the type to settle for little. Jamnia was just a stop along the way. He still had other cards up his sleeve, and his next destination would bring more tension, more blood, and an almost successful attempt to capture an unlikely enemy. With his name restored and his morale partially restored, Gorgias was transferred to a new mission to rule Idumea, a dry land with a harsh climate and difficult people. But it wasn't just a political position. There, he was also the military chief, with the freedom to crush any rebellion that arose. And of course, the Jews, who remained steadfast in their resistance, soon became his main target once again. The region was strategic. From Idumea, Gorgias could control southern Judea, cut off supply routes, and tighten the noose around the rebels. He set up barracks, reinforced garrisons, and spread troops to every corner. It seemed that nothing escaped his eyes. But the Maccabees were far from accepting this new threat with their arms crossed. They did not forget the name of the man who swore to extinguish the flame of their faith, and they remembered even more the deaths that came with each march of Gorgias. It was then that a curious name appeared in history: Dosytheus, a Jewish warrior, agile, intelligent, and courageous. In one of the most daring confrontations of that time, Dosytheus infiltrated the enemy camp and, amid the chaos of battle, managed to get his hands on Gorgias. Literally, he grabbed him tightly, trying to drag the general out of the ranks, in what seemed to be one of the most unbelievable captures of the war. But fate has a bitter way of playing with hope. At the last second, when everything seemed settled, a Thracian horseman, a war-trained brute, saw the scene and charged forward. He attacked Dosytheus ferociously and freed Gorgias from the hands of defeat. By a hair's breadth he escaped. Once again. It was almost the end, but it wasn't. And like every man who escapes death, Gorgias became even more dangerous. With his heart pounding and his fury renewed, he prepared his next moves. Little did he know that, on the other side, his image was already beginning to change, not just as a general, but as a symbol of what the people hated most. From the day he narrowly escaped Dosytheus' hands, Gorgias carried more than scars. He carried a label. He was no longer just a general. He was not just the commander of the Seleucid troops in Idumea. Now, in the eyes of the Jewish people, he was the face of oppression, a name spoken with anger, with contempt, almost as if it were a curse. They called him the cursed man. Not by chance. Wherever he went, he left a trail of destruction, screams, and mourning. He was like thunder without rain, just noise and impact. Gorgias' soldiers spared neither villages, fields, nor lives. Everything was seen as a threat. Everything was a target. And everything was justified as a peace mission, even when only dust remained in the air and blood on the ground. The elders spoke of him with clenched teeth. Children learned to fear his name before they could even read. And those who resisted in the trenches prayed not only for strength, but to never cross paths with that stone-eyed general. Gorgias became a symbol, not only of war, but of everything that sought to erase the identity of God's people. And the most curious thing is that as he tightened his fist and his methods, the opposite of what he wanted happened. The more he beat them, the more faith the people showed. The more he tried to silence them, the more the resistance spread like wildfire. It was like trying to extinguish an ember by blowing on it angrily. It only spread further. But Gorgias wasn't done yet, and what he planned next was no longer an offensive against small villages or hidden guerrillas. He wanted something bigger, a show of power, a strategy that required everything he knew and what he still thought he controlled. If there was one thing no one could deny about Gorgias, it was his cool head. He thought like a chess player. He analyzed his enemy's moves, counted his steps, waited for the right moment to take down the most important piece. Except that on this board, the rules changed all the time. The rebels did not play like a regular army. They appeared out of nowhere, attacked with fury, and disappeared as if the wind had carried them away. Even so, Gorgias did not retreat. On the contrary, he refined his strategies. He used spies, reinforced routes, guarded water sources, and controlled valleys and hills. And most importantly, he studied the patterns of the Maccabees' attacks. He knew Judas was smart, but he believed that with patience and precision, he could predict his next move. The problem is that you can't fight faith with formulas. One of Gorgias's favorite weapons was surprise. Ambushes, night movements, fast marches with light troops. He believed that fear moved faster than the sword. And often it did. Several villages surrendered just at the news that he was coming. His name preceded his banner, and when the soldiers appeared, they found the gates open and the hearts locked. But not everything went according to plan. Sometimes, the silence of the mountains hid more than loneliness. On one such campaign, Gorgias ordered his troops to launch a lightning siege on a village where he believed one of Judas's brothers was hiding. Everything was calculated, everything was timed perfectly. But when they arrived, they found no one, nothing, not a soul. The entire village had disappeared. It was as if it had evaporated. And worse, that same night, part of his convoy was attacked in an ambush that no one saw coming. This kind of thing bothered him because it showed that even with all his experience, there were still pieces on the board that he couldn't control. And while he tried to master the game with logic, on the other side, someone was playing with faith and daring. Every setback Gorgias faced was like a splinter stuck in his skin. He wasn't an ordinary general, one of those who blame their soldiers or the terrain. No. He took everything personally. When something went wrong, he carried it on his shoulders, not with regret, but with anger. It was as if each defeat left an invisible mark that only he could see, but which burned like embers. After the ambush that took his convoy by surprise, Gorgias became more withdrawn. His eyes, which were already hard, now looked like stones. No one dared to speak too close to him. And it was in this atmosphere that he decided it was time to prove, once and for all, that he was still the same strategist feared wherever he went. He needed a decisive blow, something that would erase the doubts that were beginning to arise even among his own men. It was then that he began to plan a more daring attack. This time, no small targets or failed ambushes. He wanted to go deep, reach the centers of resistance, and crush the rebels' hopes once and for all. He wanted to make noise, show who was boss. Rumor had it that he even personally reviewed the maps, mapped out alternative routes, and studied the region's winds to predict the smoke from the fires. He was more detail-oriented than ever, but the more he prepared, the more the tension grew. Because something wasn't right. It was as if he were fighting something invisible, against a force that could neither be predicted nor measured, something that did not obey the logic of war. His soldiers felt it. Some said it was superstition, others said it was the God of the Jews himself protecting his children. But Gorgias, stubborn, pressed on. And while he sharpened his weapons and fed his pride, the next battle was already brewing. A battle that would not be won by force alone, but one that would show how far pride can take a man. Pride. That was what burned in Gorgias' chest, more than any thirst for victory. He was no longer fighting only on Lysias' orders, nor for the Seleucid throne. Now it was personal. A war between him and those people who simply refused to bow down. And between him and that unlikely leader, Judas Maccabeus, who, even with fewer men, fewer weapons, and almost no resources, continued to win. Gorgias tightened the noose. He began to attack more frequently, trying to suffocate the resistance little by little. He struck, retreated, surrounded again, like a tired hunter obsessed with his prey. With each attack, a warning. With each village burned, a message. But the Jews were no longer retreating. On the contrary, it seemed that with each of Gorgias's attacks, another group appeared, another front, another flame lit in the middle of the desert. It was during one of these offensives that he marched against the outskirts of Marisa, a strategic area that could serve as a base for deeper attacks. But the Maccabees were one step ahead. They knew of the advance. They hid in the hills, camouflaged their tracks, and waited for the right moment. When Gorgias' troops spread out across the terrain, confident that they had the situation under control, the ground practically roared. Rocks slid, arrows flew, and screams cut through the wind like razors. The general tried to reorganize his men, but the surprise was violent, and once again the enemy disappeared as quickly as it had appeared. Nothing to capture, no leaders captured, only the silence that followed, the taste of dust in their mouths and frustration written all over their faces. But Gorgias, even with his ego wounded, did not know how to stop. He still believed he could turn the tide. And the curious thing is that, while his footsteps left marks on the ground, time began to do the opposite with his name. After so many battles, defeats and victories tainted with doubt, Gorgias began to disappear from conversation. Little by little, his name, which once sent shivers down people's spines, grew weaker, like a candle burning out. No one knew exactly why. There was no final battle, no grand scene of defeat, no account of his death in the sacred texts. He simply disappeared, like a shadow that dissolves at the end of the day. It was strange, to say the least, a general of that stature, with such importance within the Seleucid army, to disappear from the scene like that, as if he had been swallowed up by his own silence. Perhaps he had been called back, perhaps removed, forgotten, abandoned by those above after so many failures. Or maybe he was still there, working behind the scenes, trying to rebuild his lost respect. But to the people, he was no longer the terror he once was. That doesn't mean he was forgiven. Far from it. The name Gorgias still circulated among the Jews, but now as a bitter memory, a symbol of oppression that did not prevail. The kind of character you tell stories about to show that even the strongest, even the most prepared, can be brought down when faced with something greater than strategy and swords. And time did its job. While Judas Maccabeus became a legend, a hero of faith and courage, Gorgias slipped into oblivion. No pomp, no ending, just a hole in the narrative, a question mark hanging in the air. After all, where was he? What became of the man who once threatened to wipe out an entire people? But if his name no longer echoed loudly, what he represented was still alive. Because even outside the battlefields, the idea of Gorgias, power without a soul, continued to haunt the paths of resistance. And this story, although it seemed to have come to an end, still had one last point to tie up. Even without his presence, Gorgias continued to weigh heavily in the air. It was like that distant echo you no longer hear, but still feel. He became a memory, a symbol. And the most curious thing of all is that instead of being remembered for the wars he fought or the victories he hoped to achieve, he was marked by what he failed to achieve. His absence spoke louder than his presence. For the Seleucid Empire, he was just another name on a long list of generals, used and discarded. But for the Jews, he became the portrait of a greater enemy, one who tries to destroy the spirit without understanding that the soul cannot be broken with a sword. The books do not tell of his end. They do not say if he returned home, if he was killed, if he lived to old age, sick or forgotten. But sometimes, not knowing is precisely what makes everything stronger. Because when history stops following a character, it is his legacy, or the damage he left behind, that continues to live on. In this case, Gorgias' legacy was unintentional. Without meaning to, he helped strengthen the faith of the people he was trying to crush. Without planning it, he strengthened the resistance he wanted to destroy. His every move, every attempt at oppression served as fuel for the people to rise up stronger, more united, more determined not to be silenced. His name, once whispered in fear, came to be spoken with contempt. He became synonymous with failed tyranny, with power that tried to bend the impossible. And the impossible, as history has shown, did not surrender. The silence that followed Gorgias perhaps says more than any record written about him. A trained man with access to the best of the Seleucid army, with strategy in his head and discipline in his feet, and yet unable to defeat what cannot be seen with the eyes: faith. He came with force, he came with authority, he came with numbers, but he did not understand that the people he faced did not fight only with spears, they fought with purpose. It is curious how some historical figures are not remembered for what they built, but for what they tried to destroy. Gorgias did not found cities, did not leave laws, did not plant peace. He passed like a storm, strong, loud, frightening, and fleeting. In the end, he reaped no glory. He only became an example of what happens when someone underestimates the human spirit, and even more so, the strength of a people who believe in something greater than themselves. His story is a mirror for many who think they can control everything with power and fear. Gorgias had opportunity, resources, intelligence, but all of that sank in the same place, in the inability to understand that hearts cannot be won by force, that faith cannot be broken. That hope does not retreat just because someone shouts louder, and perhaps that is the great lesson. It is not enough to be strong, intelligent, or well-armed. You have to know what you are fighting against, and when the enemy is not a man, but a conviction, then, my friend, no sword can win. Gorgias tried to win with fear. Judas won with faith. One fell into oblivion, the other became a living part of history. And in the end, the question that remains is not about who had the biggest army, but who was fighting for the truth. And that changes everything. If you liked the story of Gorgias and want to continue following other stories of faith and overcoming adversity, be sure to like this video and share it with your loved ones. And of course, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any new content. Together, we will explore more powerful lessons from the Bible.